Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and today's video topic is one that comes up in some way, shape, or form every year or so on this channel, and honestly, I'm not even opposed to that. I put out 600-700 videos a year. I'm okay with the idea that 4 or 5 of them are almost like repeated topics of conversations that are just things that are worth reminding you of on a regular or semi-regular basis. Things about reasons to not back crowdfunding games, ways to not fall into the hype, ways to save money or this or that, and today's particular topic is one that critical reviews, or negative reviews for that matter, are not inherently more honest. It bears repeating. It bears repeating time and time again. And the particular impetus for this video is recently I covered Flow. I reviewed Flow from Fantasia Games, and I didn't even majorly dislike the game, but I gave it a 3 out of 5. I talked about the things that worked for me, and I talked about the things that didn't work for me and made me feel a little bit like that the ratio of complexity to gameplay wasn't necessarily as there for me. It was a mixed review. Not necessarily a negative review, a mixed review. And before diving too far down that rabbit hole, again, like I said similar in that video, I highly encourage you to check out Thinker Themer's review, which was very positive in it, Legion of Games, who liked it a lot, and then most importantly, the Brothers Murph put out a gameplay video where you can go ahead and get a sense or feel of how the game plays. And a variety of other channels covered it as well. I'm just picking 3 to, recommend, to highlight that they're worth looking into, just to see if the game is or isn't for you. But I found it striking just how many comments I got thanking me for my honest coverage of the game. Which on the one hand I appreciate. I appreciate the thank you. I appreciate the fact that you're grateful for it. I appreciate the fact that, I appreciate the sense and kindness behind the comment. It's also irritating in its own way. Not because of this particular video, but because of the implication that a positive review isn't honest coverage. I don't get nearly as many comments on a positive review thanking me for my honest coverage. Whether or not I put criticisms in there, which every single review I ever have has criticisms in there. There's a whole section, timestamped, the things I don't like, the things I can see others not liking. They don't get that same thank you or appreciation, which again cements the idea and the implication that critical coverage is honest. Critical coverage is true. Critical coverage has that sense of, you're willing to tell it like it is. But if I like a game, or if somebody else likes a game, they're just there to sell you on the game. And I understand parts of where that comes from. I do. I'm not ignorant to the idea of the marketing landscape that you find yourself in board game, on the tabletop YouTube space, or any social media tabletop space nowadays. I understand the reason or the incentives behind it, but I still encourage people to try to think critically through what they're getting out of their board game content, who they're getting the board game content from, and not to really focus on necessarily the idea of honest coverage or not. And if you want to thank me for my coverage ever, especially if it's critical coverage, don't thank me for my honest coverage. Thank me for the fact that I'm willing to put out a critical review, or I'm willing to include criticisms in my review. Just say that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you've included criticisms in your review. That is a totally fair and reasonable statement. Implying that a critical review is inherently more honest is frankly a disservice to the times when I'm positive on a game, and to the other content creators who like the game, who are almost certainly being just as honest with their coverage and their feelings about a game. There are issues in the tabletop space around the nature of the ratio of positive content to negative content. Those issues are just as present on my channel as well, it's worth saying, and I've covered this in a variety of videos in a variety of ways. Like I said, this is a recurring topic. There are many, many reasons why positive coverage, or neutral to positive, is far more frequent than negative coverage, and we've covered this in a lot of ways, but to give you a quick rundown, there are many channels that don't like doing critical coverage, myself included. When I'm critical on a game, I always feel bad. I'm like, is it just me? Is it a me problem? Do I really want to sit there and put out a video telling people that I didn't like X, Y, and Z when maybe it was just my experience? I don't know. I feel bad, but I still do it because, well, that's why I'm here. That is what it is to be a board game reviewer, at least the way I see my job as a board game reviewer. But the desire to not engage in negative content is one of them. Something that's far more prevalent for me as an issue is that, frankly, if I play a game I don't like, I usually don't want to give it multiple plays, and I try not to call things a review if I didn't give it multiple plays. And so, more often than not, you might see roundup coverage, or you might hear me talk about a game I didn't like, but I may not do a dedicated review on it because, frankly, if I don't want to play it again for the sake of reviewing it, I don't want to play it again, and it's that catch-22. I don't want to play a game I didn't like, but then I don't want to call a game I played once a review, and so I'm kind of stuck not being always able to give a video. That is another reason why negative content is not as frequent as positive content. There's the aspect that there's often a degree of self-selection bias at play. most channels being mindful of their time, being mindful of the fact that for most of people doing this, the ratio of pay to the ratio of work that goes into it is not a good ratio. Most people do this partially because of the love of the hobby, and yes, some degree of whether it's ad revenue or Patreon or being paid for some videos, those things do help and compensate. But for most people doing this as any form of job, it's not the greatest ratio of pay to work, and so they are mindful of their time and the things they take on. Nobody wants to take on games that don't seem like a fit for them, so there's a degree of self-selection bias at play. I never say yes to a single game that I don't think I'm the target audience for. Now, not all of them will I be, and some of them will be disappointing. Many of them will be disappointing, but at the end of the day, there's still that self-selection bias at play. The thing I already think I don't like is not being covered. There's also the aspect which most games are good. Most games are good. Most things that are put out in the world to a certain extent are good because people put time, effort, and labor into those things to try to make them good. Now, is there good and better and best? Of course there is. And are there times when they miss the mark? Of course there are. But missing the mark is likely going to be on the lower end of things because people sat there and enough people probably signed off on the idea that, hey, this seems like something that people will like. Were they right? Were they wrong? Well, that's where the public comes in and decides at a certain point. But the idea that people just throw bad garbage out in the world, that doesn't happen as much. And so there are a variety of reasons why negative content is less frequent. But the fact that it's less frequent doesn't make it inherently more honest. And the idea that we have this not collaboration, this association, I think is a damaging one. Because it paints people into a corner that, hey, if I like a game, if I want to tell you how much I enjoyed an experience, well, it might not be perceived as being genuine. I might come across as a shill. I might come across as somebody who wants another board game sent my way so I can review it. Or maybe there's even a paycheck on the other side of it because it's paid content. There's so many reasons why you might just assume that paid content, or you might look at paid content as being in some way just not accurate. And often people forget the incentives on the other side. There are channels, there are people who put out content that is almost biases themselves towards the negative because it gets that positive attention, because it gets that positive bias from the audience. And keep in mind, that's just as much of a bias as the idea of putting out positive content. Of course, there's channels who want to be mindful of the fact that when you put out content, you still want to be on that publisher's review list. And so to that end, maybe you drift towards the positive, and that is an incentive to have bias in the conversation. But if you also know that your channel loves how honest you are, and therefore you're willing to trash things on a regular basis because it gives you cred, it gives you brownie points with the audience, that's also bias. Meaning the idea that negative is inherently more honest, I don't think is true. I think that any form of extremes, or whether it's incredibly positive or whether incredibly negative, those things both have a degree of bias present. Things that fall into the middle, on the other hand, those have the least bias in general, but they also make for the most boring reviews. 3.5s out of 5s, 7 out of 10s, those aren't really making anyone talk about your coverage. Versus a 9 out of 10, a 10 out of 10, or alternatively a 4 out of 10, people are attracted to that in some way, shape, and form. Either because, how positive or how much hype there was behind it, or alternatively, how could you not have appreciated that game, but it attracts more attention one way or the other. I do think that there are channels out there. I don't like commenting a lot on other channels in terms of what they do or don't do. I don't want to talk about my peers to a certain extent, but one thing I will say is I do think there are channels out there that specifically paint their coverage as being honest. They in some way, whether on their actual videos themselves, whether on the way they title the videos, whether the things they talk about in the videos, or whether they go on social media and start talking about other channels, when there are channels out there that specifically walk around talking about how their coverage is honest and others aren't, or even just referring to themselves as an honest review, I think it does a disservice to you, to the industry, to your peers, to the general tabletop space, to the general review coverage space. I think it does a disservice to paint the idea into people's minds that there's honest coverage and dishonest coverage. I think there is a conversation that should always be had about the types of coverage that are present, the types of biases that are present, whether coverage is or isn't for you. I think those are reasonable conversations to have. But honest versus dishonest, it just paints this narrative. You don't win when you paint yourself as honest. What you do is you put the idea into the general sphere, the general audience, that they're being lied to. And that's going to be just as present when you have your own positive review that you put out, even though you've titled it an honest review. I think those things are present. And I think sometimes people find it easier to look at the one-offs as opposed to the full picture. When I put out a negative review, I'll get people thanking me for being honest. When I put out a super positive review, it's just another time that Alex likes the game. And I mean, there's people who see the full picture, make no mistake, but I think that a lot of times people, myself and other channels, get painted into the corner of the individual coverage they put out as opposed to the full ecosystem. Sure, I was mixed on Flow, but also have you considered the fact that it gives far more credence to the idea that I loved Unconscious Mind and Endless Winter, 2 games from Fantasia Games that I think are chef's kiss. They're incredible experiences that are worth trying. I think they're great games, so it does buy more credibility if you look at those things in a balance, but it's not that one's positive, one's negative, it's the full ecosystem. There's Lords of Ragnarok, a game that lots of people have had issues with, and I've had a lot of fun, granted, with the prototype. I still haven't played the final game. I'm too many games to play, not enough time, but I had a lot of fun with the prototype. And a lot of other channels were more mixed on that one. That's a game that's gotten mixed coverage, and just because I liked it, am I a hype man or this or that? But also, what about Nemesis? I've been very vocal with the fact that Nemesis is a game that, as much as I appreciate aspects of it, I don't think Nemesis is a game for me. You have to look at the full ecosystem, back and forth. One I liked, one more middling. You have a Marvel Zombies, a game I loved and talked about a lot. I think Zombicide Deceased from Come On, I think they're both fantastic titles. But then I've also been very vocal about the fact that Zombicide Invader and Zombicide 2nd Edition didn't work for me. Again, don't look at one in either direction. Look at the full picture, the times when people are willing to give their thoughts and opinions across the board. There's Mythic Mischief, a game I love from Vivey Games. I love Mythic Mischief. I think it's fantastic. I've been very positive as well. Fractious Sky is great, although I have said that I prefer City of Spies. I also really enjoy Moonrakers, although I did say that the original game I had more mixed feelings on. The expansions came in. And then there's Veiled Fate, which again, I like. I like Veiled Fate. I think it's a good game, but it's also not a game that I've been as positive on. But again, you have to look at that full ecosystem. Sure, I'll sit there and wear a Mythic Mischief hoodie and a Mythic Mischief hat because I think Hy-Vee Games makes great gear for the board games. And I think Mythic Mischief is one of my favorite games in my collection. But the full picture of where I'm willing to be critical and not, those things are all present. You have to look at the full picture as far as what people put out. I think where it is worth talking about the reviewer ecosystem, or the social media landscape around tabletop games, whatever you want to call it, the marketing ecosystem, because there is a marketing machine. And again, full transparency, Board Game Co. does paid content. We do paid previews. We will not call them reviews. We will not give our opinions. There are previews on this channel, and there are paid gameplays. I try to be as transparent as possible about the potential bias, but again, there is paid coverage on this channel too, which might be a problem for you, and I respect and appreciate that. But I think it's worth knowing what type of coverage is out there. Rather than painting creators as honest or not honest, or those willing to tell it like it is, or those who are, just continuing to suck it up so they can get more review copies from whatever publisher, I think understanding the ecosystem and understanding the content, understanding the channels that resonate with you, I think that is a far more valuable thing than simply being upset at the social media landscape. I think that you should understand the difference between review content and preview content. I think you should understand which channels do paid coverage and which videos you're watching are paid coverage. Not because paid coverage doesn't mean it's true. There are many channels out there that do paid coverage along with an opinion. And it's up to you to decide whether that works for you or not. It's up to you to try to watch. And there's different channels that operate in different ways, even within that landscape. There are channels that will give paid content with opinions that has negative content in there. There are channels that understandably will say, hey, I'm not going to cover the games that are negative when there's a paycheck attached to it because I just don't want to filter that relationship, but I'll only cover the ones I like. Ultimately, there is bias present in all senses. There's bias present from the desire to be honest with your audience, which again I think is stupid. Critical. I think there's bias because you want to work with the publisher and get games, and there's certainly bias when there's a paycheck involved. None of those things means the coverage isn't honest, but they are things you should be aware of as someone who's watching this content and deciding whether it's for you or not. For me, for example, I get no value out of review content that has a paycheck attached to it. That's my personal line. But we'll all have. It's not to say it's honest or not honest. It's just that's not something I get value out of. But you might. And there are many channels who might not get value out of my content because I might have a paid video with a publisher here, and then 2 months later do a separate review of a coverage with that publisher, and that might be too close as well. Everyone will have their own line, so it's not about vilifying one line or the other. It's about understanding the relationships people have with those around them, the types of content they put out, how frequently they are or aren't providing critical content, because not all channels want to provide critical content. Some channels are just recommendation channels. That's what they are. This is very present on Instagram as well. If you're following Instagram content, most Instagram content is just recommendation content. Then there's TikTok channels. There's lots of channels out there that are just there to provide recommendations. Many of this will tell you that themselves. Many of this will just say, hey, I don't want to talk about bad games. It's not why I get fun of the hobby. And that's fine. Just understand at that point that it's not so much a review channel as it is a recommendation channel. And I don't think that's inherently a problem. As long as their tastes continue to deliver, as long as you watch them get value from the content, and when you pick up a game based on their recommendations, on the average, it's never going to be every time, but on the average, that recommendation is working for you, that's still a value-added service. That's still content that's relevant to you. If you watch one of these channels and, 8 out of every 10 games that they recommend to you is a good fit for your tastes, that is still adding value to the content you get out of it, whether or not they are putting out critical content on those games. So I think it's about understanding the ecosystem far more, but presenting the idea that it's honest versus dishonest coverage. Again, there's review coverage, there's preview coverage. Review coverage is going to be ideally pros and cons, telling you what they liked and didn't like, giving you critical coverage whenever they possibly can, but critical does not mean every game has to be bad. It just means that they have the criticisms within their coverage. Whether they like it or not, regardless of the final review, the criticisms are baked into the coverage. A preview is often going to be more of a showcase. A preview content, whether paid or unpaid, is going to be more of a showcase of what the game is, helping you decide whether the game is right for you. There's playthrough channels. I mean, before you play Brothers Murph, there's tons of playthrough channels out there that will give you a sense of what the game is like, showing the game. And Brothers Murph, by the way, their overviews, their first 5 minutes of their playthroughs, they deserve their own videos. The Brothers Murph content is absolutely fantastic. I mean, before you play as well, there are so many channels that put out fantastic content that are worth recommending, but that type of content is invaluable in the sense that it gives you the sense and the feeling of how the game plays, of how the back and forth works as the people play them. That is valuable content, and the paycheck potentially attached to it should be somewhat immaterial when it's not even attached to an opinion. There is time, effort, and energy expended on doing video content in general, and many channels would not be able to justify the continued time they spend in the board game space without some form of monetization, although that should be an entirely separate video about the nature of monetization. But understanding that content. So reviews, previews, playthroughs, recommendations, recommendation channels. Again, the idea that you have recommendation-based content. Deciding whether a paid opinion does or doesn't work for you. That's a thing that to be mindful of as well. Learning when channels only operate in the extremes. That's something I mentioned earlier in this video, but there are channels that their content has to be dramatic in some way, shape, or form. It has to be something on one end of the spectrum. And I just, personally speaking, again, everyone has to decide for themselves what value they get from that. I personally find most game reviews are going to be boring. If you're a game review, it's going to be more boring on average because most games are good and few games are great and few games are, bad. But in the middle, most games are going to be, hey, this is a pretty solid game. Enjoy. Does it blow my socks off? No, unfortunately not, because thousands of games come out every year and only a handful of games can do that. Is it terrible? Mostly not, because so many games are learning from those that came before it and trying to put out something good. And so extreme content on either end of the spectrum generally, again, isn't likely as much of a match. Learn what types of content are out there and learn what things work for you. Some of what I just covered in the past 5 minutes are things that, if you watch Tom Vassell, the Dice Towers video of the problems with being a board game reviewer, many of those aspects were covered in Tom's video, which I think is a worthwhile video for you to go out and watch and get a sense of the fact that there's so many struggles and challenges of being a content creator. And make no mistake, I love being here. But that idea that this is never a perfect line of how to navigate, of how to be a right fit for everyone. And by the way, if you are a content creator, you're never going to be the right fit for everyone. You're going to find the audience that resonates with the type of content you put out, and hopefully they will decide that they like what you do, because there will be a sect of the audience of the internet, there'll be a sect of the internet that values what you do, and there'll be a sect of the internet that hates what you do, and that's just life. Speaking of Tom Vassell, I guess, let's end this video on a bit of a recommendation myself. Because if you are looking for review-based content, I'm going to give my own personal channels that I find I get the most value from their review-based content. This is not in any way an across-the-board covering every single thing. I'm sure there's channels I've forgotten in there. And to be specific, this is not a recommendation of channels I get value from. There are a lot of channels I get value from. This specifically are the board game review channels that I get value from. Meaning there's a lot of recommendation-based content, there's a lot of entertainment-based content, there's a lot of other types of content I get value from in the board game space. But if you want my personal list of the channels I appreciate their review content, that I do not find it too much in the extremes, that I find it to give positive and critical and all the things, if you're looking for that type of experience, I highly recommend first and foremost the Dice Tower. They review so many games, including so many mediocre and bad games, they're the ones who really take it on themselves to sit there and say, we're not just here to review the things we have an interest in, not just here for that selection bias, we're here to review anything that's put out into the board game space. There's also going to be Thinker Themer. They are not shy about saying when a game doesn't work for them, or one of them for that matter. There's King of Average. He likes a lot of games. He also doesn't like a lot of games, and he'll be free to tell you about those things in his videos. And if you're looking for that freedom to cover things critically, King of Average, Michael definitely does that. There's Room and Board. Chris George from Room and Board, he's not shy about telling you when a game, was really good, really enjoyable, or also whether it's just an experience that didn't work for him. This Board Game Hangover, fantastic channel with fantastic production value and such a good dynamic duo between the two of them. And again, they'll like a lot of things. If you watch, that's the thing, if you watch any individual video from, let's say, Board Game Hangover, your average video might drift more towards a positive, but that's also true for my channel or many other channels. But then if you watch their content, if you actually tune in, you'll see that they're not shy about saying when a game didn't work for them either. And that's an important distinction. If you're looking for review coverage as opposed to recommendation coverage, that's important. It doesn't mean that the recommendation coverage is not honest. It just means that there's recommendation coverage and then there's review coverage. And Board Game Hangover, I definitely find, does give you solid review coverage. And then there's Board Game Bollocks, who is an incredibly entertaining individual who is as passionate when he hates a game as he is when he likes a game. And his content is it's both entertaining and informative at the same time. That's just a small subset of, well, that's a small subset. I say those are some of the channels that I get very positive review coverage from. They're not the exclusive ones. I'm sure there's others I forgot. And there's a lot of other channels I get lots of value from, just possibly as a recommendation channel or as a playthrough channel or as an entertainment-based channel. There's different types of content in the board game space. But the entire reason I made this video is because of the frequent reminder that should be said. Critical coverage is not inherently more honest. It just isn't. It just has a different kind of bias. A bias that we're less in a rush to talk about. Because we love talking about the bias of relationships and money, but we don't necessarily talk about the bias of being perceived as honest. There's value to being perceived as honest. There is value to that. It means people will tune in more because you're the one who's telling it like it is. Sometimes just being boring is telling it like it is. And that's just less interesting. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radical from Board Game Co. And I do appreciate all of your comments on that video. On any video I put out, I do appreciate the comments. I'm not trying to shout them down. I think that the kind words and the feelings behind them are appreciated to no end. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for watching that video and this video and every other video I put out. At the same time, I'm being just as honest when I love a game. Thank you. And I hope you have a good one.